Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to another Free Market Foundation podcast/vlog. This particular episode with me, Chris Hattingh, project manager here at the FMF. I hope you're all doing well. Thank you for tuning in to another one of our episodes. Really appreciate the support, all of you sharing our episodes and the work that we do. It's very important to us and we really do appreciate it a lot. This week I wanted to talk about a sort of technical issue that's come up recently, especially now around the World Cup. I know for many of you South Africans, you might not want to talk about the World Cup at the moment, given the weekend's result against the All Blacks. But this is more about sort of economics and social concerns around sports broadcasting, sports rights, that sort of thing. To give you the background on this, earlier this year, ICASA held public hearings on the draft Sports Broadcasting Services Amendment Regulations. As part of a review to, quote, identify and list national sporting events while ensuring that subscription broadcasting service licensees do not acquire exclusive rights that prevent or hinder the free-to-air broadcasting of national sporting events, end quote. Now, what does this mean in a nutshell? It pretty much means that ICASA is looking at how MultiChoice, and MultiChoice is the target of these proposed regulations, how MultiChoice have in the past gotten the exclusive rights to sporting events. For example, the Rugby World Cup. You can also think about the Cricket World Cup, the Soccer World Cup, all of these examples of big sporting events. Now, we know that these events are widely watched in South Africa. South Africans are very passionate about their sports, especially cricket, rugby, and soccer. And now ICASA is moving towards these regulations to look at how they can sort of push MultiChoice in what they deem the correct and the right and the moral direction, because I think it's bad that MultiChoice always has exclusive rights to these events. Now, just before I get into more of the nitty-gritty, I want you to keep in mind the philosophical point that you cannot have a right to something that someone else has produced. If you have a right to something that someone else has produced, that means you have a right to their mind, to their time, to their abilities, to their skills, basically to what they produce. That means that you have a right to what they produce, and they have to give it to you if that right is recognized sort of by the government and in the country, broadly speaking. And this is a big problem. Someone has to bid for these exclusive sports rights from different sporting bodies around the world, whomever might hold these rights. Someone such as MultiChoice and the SABC, they have to bid for the rights to broadcast these events. But someone has to do the work, someone has to produce it, someone has to build infrastructure, broadcast it, all of that stuff. It doesn't come without costs. IFMF Executive Director Leon Lowe often makes the point of there's no such thing as a free lunch. Someone has to produce these things. They don't just sort of come out of the ether, out of nothing. The work has to be put in, work has to be done, and it takes a lot of investment and time on the part of MultiChoice to secure these rights and then broadcast them in a package that is attractive to consumers, to buyers, to people like me and you. For some of us, it might not be a value to buy these rights, and that's fine. That's our prerogative to do so. But for other people, they have to pay MultiChoice because MultiChoice in turn has to bid for these broadcasting rights. They don't just come for free. Now, part of ICASA's push with these regulations is that an entity such as the SABC cannot get these rights, acquire these rights from MultiChoice because, as we all know very well, they're in a very bad financial position. I think a few times in the last few months they haven't even been able to pay their own employees, which is very sad, but it's another indication of what a bad state the SABC is in. And due to their own failings, their sort of management and government interference, one can argue for, they haven't made the correct decisions in the past. Financially speaking, we don't know if bidding for these big sports events is going to be to MultiChoice's to their benefit or their downfall in the future. But the point is, it's their right to do so, that they try and invest in these sort of events and try and build infrastructure around it and try and motivate and convince people to buy their DSTV packages. It's up to them through marketing and advertising and that sort of thing, competitive pricing, to try and convince people to buy their products. There's no force involved. It's all voluntary. And I think this is a crucial point that ICASA is missing. People voluntarily choose to buy packages from DSTV. They can also use other means to watch the Rugby World Cup, for example. Those means probably aren't legal. They're not going to be the best quality, but the means are out there. So it's up to individual consumers how they want to consume things. For ICASA to be pushing, for this sort of aspect of if MultiChoice acquires these rights, they must now share it with SABC, for example, or give it to them at a lower price, completely misses the point of what MultiChoice has had to put in to acquiring these rights. As I mentioned earlier, these rights don't come for free. They don't come from nothing. Someone has to actually earn the money and use that money and invest it. Just like you invest your hard-earned money in different investments, maybe in your children, in property, in stocks, all that sort of stuff. It's your own decision in what you invest that money, and the same applies to MultiChoice. Just because it's a company, a big one at that, doesn't mean that there's anything wrong, morally speaking, with them bidding for the sports rights and acquiring them. For some of us, we might not like it. We might think they're too big, that they need to be brought low. But I'm afraid that is an emotional argument and not a morally correct and rational argument. You cannot expect them to invest all this money and time into acquiring the sports rights and then to just give them away for free to someone such as the SABC, for example. That takes no account of the economic investment that they have made in acquiring the sports rights. And to me, it completely misses the point of a competitive market. ICASA might say that they are pushing for a more competitive market, something where the sports rights are shared equally, whatever that means. These amorphous terms are used a lot to justify all sorts of government interventions and regulations, but they don't really mean anything concrete and practical economically. They're just used to justify an intervention into a company that many people in a body such as ICASA don't think should have as much power or influence as it does. And that's simply the case on the ground at the moment. The SABC has made very many bad decisions in the past, and that's why they're in the bad financial position that they are now. MultiChoice has made good decisions. Just to give you an example of where a traditional big broadcaster has been outbid for these sports rights in New Zealand this year. Normally Sky Sports New Zealand broadcasts the Rugby World Cup. Well, this year a startup company called Spark, they won the rights for the Rugby World Cup, and they're heavily based on streaming. I know there were a lot of issues from what I've read online with some of the streaming during the All Blacks game, and that upset many people back in New Zealand. But the point is that this company outbid Sky Sports for these rights, and it was completely their right to do so. When let's say World Rugby puts this out into the open, that the World Cup is coming and people can bid and companies can bid for the rights to broadcast the tournament, I don't think they favor anyone in particular. If they do, obviously that should be exposed and talked about at some point. But anyone can bid for these rights. And in the case of New Zealand, Spark won the rights, and that's great for them. No one is entitled to these rights just because a company such as MultiChoice or Sky Sports have had these rights and have successfully bid for them in the past doesn't mean that they're guaranteed them in the future, and nor should they be. It should always be open for people to bid, and that's been the case with South Africa and MultiChoice. They simply give the best bid to the people holding the rights, and then they win that bid. And I think that is a good thing, and it's a moral thing. Talking pragmatically, and if you would like some reasons for justifying or working, more, like if you want to talk about the social interest, social cohesion, national interest, all of these things, for justifying the case for MultiChoice getting these rights, they invest a lot of money in grassroots sports in South Africa, and I know transformation is a big concern for many people in South Africa, as it should be, given South Africa's history of apartheid and discrimination against black South Africans. The money that MultiChoice gets from people buying these products from them, and part of that is that they have, for example, the right to broadcast the Rugby World Cup. Part of that money that they get from consumers, they invest in grassroots development and grassroots sport. Without that investment, I don't think we would see as transformed a Springbok rugby team as we are seeing at the moment. Money needs to be pumped into grassroots sport all across South Africa, and without that, development does not happen. We can push for that as much as we want. We can introduce all sorts of quotas, everything like that, and you can make different arguments for those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, money needs to be invested in these things. Coaches need to be educated and trained. Same thing with medical staff, that sort of thing, with video technology, with teaching young players and young kids the different sports, and they also need equipment, and that stuff doesn't come for free. I go back to what Leon Lowe has said: there's no such thing as a free lunch. These things are not going to come out of nowhere. Money needs to be spent and invested, and MultiChoice has, I think, to their credit, and SuperSport, which is of course part of MultiChoice, they focused a lot on grassroots development and social upliftment, and they should be given credit for that. But again, that can't be done in a vacuum. It can't be done without money from their consumers. And in order to get that money, they need to be able to show consumers what consumers can get from their products. They can't just go not forcing down people's doors, extorting money from them. They need to appeal to them. Just like any other company in other industries, they need to give the best reason and best case. It's almost like a court of law. They need to give the best case for why that company, the consumer should choose that company over another. And I think that's a good thing. You can see the way in which they use their money, in where they spend it, on the social upliftment and the grassroots development. Of course, they use it to bid for these sports rights in the future, but they reinvest money back into the community. I don't think we can say that the money is simply thrown up into the air, not used for anything further along. It would not be in their self-interest to just spend the money on frivolous things and not reinvest it in their own infrastructure and also in the grassroots development around the country. It's to their benefit to keep reinvesting that money that they get from broadcasting these events, such as the Rugby World Cup, and I think that's a really good thing. So on that note, I think I'll end. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, that you learned one or two things. I think we always need to be concerned when government bodies push for more regulation, such as ICASA is doing in this case. I think it's highly concerning to put a target on a company such as they're putting on MultiChoice. I don't think it's correct. I don't think it's moral. It leaves a very bad taste in my mouth of government sort of targeting a company because they think they're too big and they're not being fair and they're not sharing. All of these things. It's very emotive language. But at the end of the day, it doesn't make the correct moral and economic arguments. And we should question these things. We should figure out why certain bodies such as ICASA are pushing for these regulations, and then also investigate what MultiChoice themselves, in this example, what they use that money for and how they acquire these rights. They didn't hold a gun to anyone's head. They didn't force any other company out. They didn't make the bad decisions for the SABC, as much as I'm sure some people in the SABC would like to blame them. This is simply a case of one company outbidding another, and there's nothing, absolutely nothing, morally wrong with that. And I think we should keep making this point. When you hear of any government regulation, whether it's with these regulations, or with what they call big data, any of these sorts of things, when government is pushing for these regulations, you should sort of look at the issues underlying it, what economic and moral, philosophical arguments there are for each side, and anything where the government is trying to come in and use force to force a company to give up something it has acquired through an open and competitive market without using force against anyone else, to me, is a very dangerous sign. It sets a very dangerous precedent of that government can decide when a company should share what it has earned and what it has built. And I don't think we should ever reach that point in South Africa where the government has this much power over any company or any individual, because then they're always going to favor their contacts, their friends, those who they deem deserving. And we cannot give government that sort of arbitrary power over our lives. All right, I'm going to end there. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll talk to you guys again next week. Have a good week ahead. Enjoy all the rugby, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.